Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today. We are excited to have you here for our Pathlock Innovation Series. This presentation is titled How to Identify True SOD Risk with Advanced Quantification Analysis. We're doing this presentation with our partner Protiviti, and we'll introduce more about that in a minute. I'm putting in the chat a link to our website page with the Pathlock Innovation Series that has the schedule of events for today and tomorrow for the SAP Innovation Days during this series. If you would like to register for any of the upcoming sessions for the rest of today or tomorrow, you can click on that link and it will give you access to registering for those. Will you please go to the next slide? I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. If you have any audio issues during this webinar, click on Preferences and then Audio. From there, you can check to see if you are using the appropriate audio device. You can also click on the play sound to check if you can hear the sound coming from your speakers. This presentation will take approximately 40 minutes. There will be a Q&A session following the presentation, so please type any questions into the Q&A chat box for our speakers to answer at the end of the event. To prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. And will you go to the next slide? With that, I'm going to turn the time over in a minute to our speakers. Today, our speakers are Rocco Sacramone and John Sacramucci, and they're just going to go ahead and introduce themselves.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'll go first. My name is Rocco Sacramone. I'm a manager with Protiviti in the New York metro area in our technology consultant enterprise application solution group. And as Stephanie said, I'm joined with John Scaramucci today. And I'll let him do a quick introduction.
Thanks, Rocco. Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. My name is John Scaramucci, Associate Director with Protiviti, also out of our New York office. Been working in this space around SOD quantification, as an extension of SAP security for a long time, about 12 years, and helped Rocco and Natalie, who's pictured here, put together this presentation, and filling in speaking for Natalie today. So I'm looking forward to sharing what we can with everyone. And I do apologize if either of our voices sound terrible, because we're both, 'tis the season for colds and flus, so we're both coming down with something here. But thanks, Rocco. I'll let you go ahead.
All right. Awesome. And just one more thing about me, I've also been primarily focused on, the SAP controls and security space with an emphasis on SOD quantification as well for about 7 years. And John has taught me everything I know. So you're in good hands in this presentation. So getting into it, what are we looking for today? What's our agenda going to be, and what are some of our objectives? So first, we're going to bring you over with an overview of SOD quantification, why it's important, SOD in general, segregation of duties in general, how SOD quant is going to support, your general SAP security structure and monitoring in general, some of the best practices for embarking on an SOD quant project, how to review, investigate, and socialize your results. We're going to go into those review techniques on actually performing analyses, and then we're going to have some case studies before our wrap up and QA. So with that, I'll jump into the first section. So just a conceptual overview of SOD quant and really SOD in general, and why is it important? So really, first off here, why is SOD a challenge, and why can it be so difficult to address? And that can be dependent on a variety of factors. Not one scenario is 100% the same. That can boil down to a company size may present its own challenges, risk appetite, regulations, depending on the organization's business in general. How big or small the company organization is, its complexity there, its risk culture, security not being a priority unless something goes wrong, right? And then even solutions and processes that you have to analyze and manage your SOD risk, potentially having gaps in that as well. But all those challenges effectively can be, addressed and is dependent on your SOD, risk management maturity. So there's a little bit on this slide here, and you have different levels, right? So at the very bottom, you have your periodic checks. So these are your more manual SOD reviews, right? You're reporting on false positives and even false negatives for that matter. And as you go up the levels, so to speak, you become more efficient. You become a more optimized, environment. The key takeaway here on this slide is I'll call attention to the two axes, right? As you mature in your risk management, in your SOD risk management processes, you're effectively reducing your overall risk exposure. And also a key factor here is effectively reducing your overall time and level of effort when addressing SOD risks. And even as you go up the rung, if you will, in your levels of maturity, there can still be issues with an optimized environment. You can have a significant number of SODs that pop up after you go through a remediation exercise. Even having, you put in place a relatively good control of having firefighter, right? But firefighter, shouldn't be a cure-all, right? And it may be abused in some way, shape, or form. And another one is, you would put in place more manual mitigating controls or mitigating controls in general. And those mitigating controls are either, there's gaps in them. They're either not regularly performed or there's, it doesn't necessarily address the risk. So again, just to keep in mind, there are even places that can present an issue even in an optimized environment. But that gets into, SOD management in general, SOD quantification. So we ask the question, is there a better way to manage SOD? And the answer is yes. And it's a combination, right, of using or provisioning with SOD solutions and leveraging SOD quantification analysis. So with your SOD solutions, SAP GRC is one of them as an example. You're identifying the potentials, right? So anything that may happen. A user may have a segregation of duty issue based on the rule set that your organization has put together. And then on the flip side, you have SOD quantification. And SOD quantification is important because it takes the potential and helps you realize that, if any. So you're effectively trying to identify the true SODs. How many times did the user execute SOD? How much dollar amount did they transact with it? So on and so forth. And that's really the crux of it. Within your SAP, access landscape, if you will, what SOD quantification helps you achieve is insight into the real exceptions that are being generated within your organization. And just a baseline for everybody, what is an actual violation versus a potential violation? So you have your quote unquote access risk on the top here, where you have a potential violation where a user, so say Rocco Sacramone, has role 1 and role 2 with set amount of authorizations underneath me that allows me to both create a vendor and then pay a vendor or enter a vendor payment. Now that's just the potential, right? If we look at SOD quantification and keeping in mind a key factor of sequencing also, because sequencing does play into your risk. Say as an example, for my actual violation this is uncovered through an SOD quant analysis, I ended up creating or maintaining a record for a vendor, and then after that I went ahead and actually processed the payment off of that vendor I maintained. That is an actual violation, and that is the focus of SOD Quant and what it aims to bring to light, if you will. And it's one last thing I'll call attention to is that with an actual violation, mitigating controls are great, but may not always find every potential violation that's occurring. So SOD quantification is that next step in, I guess, evolution, if you will. But with that, I'll jump over, or I'll hand it over to John to jump into the next section.
Thank you, Rocco. So Rocco, I think, did a great job there, kind of setting the stage, right, of what is SOD quantification. You know, how does it relate to what you typically think of when you think of SOD, right? Is typically around your access, whereas SOD quantification, we're looking more at the transactions that occurred. But you know, typically SOD is managed through some sort of access control or access management solution. The most common Rocco mentioned before, SAP GRC or SAP Access Control. Here's an example slide of the different modules of that. So there's a lot of things you're typically doing around your access and around the SOD that you have in your environment, right? You can run your ARA reports or your SOD reports to analyze as we go around the wheel here. You can automate your assignments, right? If there's no SOD, let that go through, or capture SODs while you're provisioning. And force approvals or review on the SOD that's going to be triggered if a piece of access is provisioned. You can define your roles and manage them within these solutions to make sure that the roles themselves that are provisioned stay clean, and provide other types of control with that solution. But with your SOD quantification type of analysis, what we're trying to do is really extend that capability, focusing on this mantra of getting clean and staying clean. So your access control solutions help you do that, but the SOD quantification is where we kind of take the next step, right, and continue on that SOD roadmap or the maturity model. So the journey here that we see most often on this, we're looking at on this slide. If you go back, Rocco, the getting clean steps, right, is do we do some sort of remediation or design in our roles to be free of conflicts? We often still see some access remains. So to manage that, we have our tools like access control, all those modules, and this SOD quantification complements that by helping us understand what's really happening in the environment. So the next couple slides will really try to help visually illustrate this concept that we're talking about extending your security, your access management. So when we think about what the risk exposure is as a result of your SOD, right? The first place we start with an SOD project or SOD management in general is our rule set, right? So most companies define a set of risks. And if I draw your attention to the chart here, you see a bell curve. This is meant to represent just the number of potential SOD risks or conflicts that could exist, right? So think of like a very generic or full library of SOD risks with 300 different combinations of access, right? Most companies zero in within the box here and target a subset of all those different combinations and try to monitor a reasonable set of risks that actually pertain to their business. So companies end up anywhere between 50 or 60 risks to 150 or so that they will monitor, right? And that's still a lot of potential combinations. But once you start monitoring that set of risks, you'll end up with something like this chart, right? Where you have all your risks are these different columns, and how high they are represents how many users you have, right? So just get our minds thinking about what does a risk exposure landscape look like? Well, the first thing you usually do is run a report that shows something like this. Here's all the different risks or the different business processes that we have our risks, and the number of conflicts based on just the number of users that have access to perform these SOD risks, right? So say we see this chart in our executive steering meeting and we decide we need to address this somehow, right? Or our external auditors look at this and have concerns that there's not good control in the environment. So how do we address this, right? So the first step most companies take is doing some sort of remediation on this access. So whether you do a redesign or some targeted remediation, we can bring this down. So the darker blue blocks here are meant to show where we've reduced the number of users that have access to these risks. In some cases, it's dropped really small. All the way on the right there, you see that it's dropped off completely after our redesign. But the fact remains that there's usually some access there, and that's because it's hard to remediate, you know, security roles in SAP. It's hard to strip away access from people when it's part of their jobs. So the next step that some companies take is performing a full business transformation, trying to redesign their processes. Maybe they're trying to hire, you know, onboard, try to address their headcount issues to get around these risks. And this is a massive undertaking. It's a huge project for a company to go down this avenue. And what usually happens is that you still do have some residual risk, like you see in the green boxes there, and the highlighted box now that we're showing is, you know, this is the actual risk exposure that you have. So whether we're starting out at the top, or we've done some remediation, or we've really gone and transformed our business as much as possible, the unfortunate issue is that there's usually still some SODs that need to remain for whatever reason. But, you know, Rocco touched on some of those challenges at the beginning, right? It could be headcount, company size, just, you know, inability to reinvent some processes or some ways around needing to have this access provision to your user. So how do we get, you know, how do companies typically deal with that? The most common thing Rocco just mentioned is mitigating controls. So these controls could be, you know, a variety of things. It's reconciliations that are part of a process, some sort of detective review or analysis, which, you know, an SOD quantification is basically like that. But sometimes it's much more straightforward of just running a report. You have enterprise level controls like, you know, system configuration and things that you can document and take advantage of as controls. But all of these things, you know, any control requires time and effort, right? So no matter what, you're going to be spending time mitigating the access that you have out there. So the important thing when you're spending that time is to make sure you're capturing the violations or the exceptions that you want, because anywhere that you don't have controls in your business, whether it's a certain site or, you know, there's just some users that maybe they're the report preparer or the control reviewer for a lot of these things, but they also, you know, have to transact in the business. They might be, you know, conflict of interest there. You end up with some unmitigated risk, which is sort of meant to be the outside of the chart here, and everything inside is where your controls have good coverage over your processes, but there's always some residual unmitigated risk that kind of is out there. So when you're performing these controls, right, we know that there's potential for some actual violations to be occurring, right? That the actual instance of someone creating a vendor and paying that vendor, you know, that's the real concern area for an SOD like that. So it's possible that those transactions are occurring, you know, within our blue box here, and that the controls we perform will capture those. But there's always a possibility that it happens, you know, maybe partially at a site where we don't have good controls or we don't have good resourcing to monitor these types of things. And then the worst case scenario is what happens when these violations are occurring outside of our controls. They're, you know, they're being performed by the people that perform the controls, or they're being performed at a site where they have really low headcount and everyone has to kind of transact on everything. So how do we, you know, identify what's happening there? And that is really what the, you know, the true risk exposure is what access remains and what are the materialized, you know, exceptions or violations of those access conflicts, and where are they occurring. So, you know, this picture is the worst case scenario where the actual violations are happening outside of the controls that we're mitigating our SOD risk with. So with that, I will turn it back over to Rocco to kind of walk us through, you know, how do we embark on a project to try to use some of these concepts at you know, potentially your company.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yep. So as John said, with the actual violations that come up, and really for any of those scenarios, you know, SOD quantification, there's a time and a place depending on, you know, where your organization is at, and there's several different points of time that you can jump in and have an SOD quant process. And here are some of the cases. So as John mentioned before, there's SOD remediation activities. Before those SOD remediation activities occurring, that would be a good opportunity to potentially do an SOD quantification. analysis, this is where you can effectively focus on, your high risk areas prior to any, or to better equip the SOD remediation piece of it that comes down the line. Then also you have the quote unquote during. So if you're in the middle of or your organization's in the middle of a security redesign, SOD Quant, SOD Quant is going to be well equipped to complement, if you will, the testing that is and the cleanup that is going on by giving that visibility into some of your high risk areas. And then after, you have your ongoing monitoring controls. So close to real time, which we'll get to in a little bit. But having an ongoing monitoring process, regardless if it's real time or a periodic manual review, which we'll get into, really gives you visibility and helps you maintain control over your risk exposure and your SOD violations, no matter where they kind of fall on that plot that John was speaking about in the earlier slides. So what are the approaches to SOD Quant? So there are two that we stick to. One is more focused on historical data, and the other is more on the future transactional side. And they come in the forms of a manual quantification assessment and more, as I was saying just before, real-time, a real-time analysis or alerts that occur. The difference between the two, the best way to sum them up is with the questions down below. From a manual quantification perspective, what happened in the past quarter, year, or period of time that you are concerned with reviewing. Whereas, the real time and the future transactions, you can ask yourselves the question, what is happening today? Am I concerned about what activity is going on in my business, today? And the key differences between the two, as I've alluded to, a manual quantification is a point-in-time assessment that looks back in your transactional history over a given period of time. Now, that period of time can be defined by the organization. It can be defined by compliance requirements, so on. This is more of a manual, as the name says, more of a manual process, a little bit more time-consuming because you are going back to detect your actual violations for that time period. And to do this manual quantification assessment, there are various tools or point-in-time assessment tools that can help you achieve this rather than doing it 100% manually. Then on the flip side, in the real-time, quote-unquote, real-time alerts or real-time monitoring, as I mentioned, it's an ongoing review. It's a more active approach to addressing your risk exposure. And as we said before, the available solutions, SAP Access Control as an example, and even Access Violation Management, or formerly Access Violation Management, more EBCP TM for those made by Pathlock, or for those familiar with Pathlock. So now that we have the two types of analysis that we can do, or quantification types, another key aspect is to come up with a methodology. And we basically like to stick to these 4 key steps. So scoping, identifying your high risk processes, flagging your high risk areas, and then one of the more important parts, follow up. So I'll start with scope. During the scoping phase, regardless of where you are in your, or I guess, organization's remediation process, right? As we said, like before, middle, or after, you want to focus on the business. You want to identify business processes and modules that you believe have either gaps in mitigating controls, higher transaction counts, right? Higher population base, and even areas where you may have suspected fraud, or even audit has more emphasis on looking at that area. Then once you define your scope, you want to effectively identify your high risk processes, right? So of that subset of the areas you want to look at, what is the most critical? And you can basically try to sort these out by looking at what SOD findings you've had that have come out of your provisioning tool, or as an example, GRCAC or GRC in general, Look at what users have conflicts. Are there a large number of manual controls, as I said, or mitigating controls, and so on. And then once you actually identify these areas, you have to go through the process of actually identifying the SODs that have occurred, right? So this is when your actual analysis will come into play, where you're going in and you're flagging, okay, this user actually produced side A and side B of a risk. And there's different way to group these, right? So business units, company codes, locations, further filtering down different areas that you can focus on depending on what comes back in your analysis. And then, as I said, one of the more important parts, in my opinion, is the follow-up piece of this. So the key aspect of this, and to for an organization to get the most use out of an SOD quantification process, identifying ownership and effectively discussing these issues is key. And it allows whatever team that's producing the SOD analysis, gives them an outlet, maybe somebody in the business or just effectively an owner over the risk, to help drive and potentially remediate that risk and basically find out, why is it occurring? Is it something that is truly an SOD, truly needed for the business because there's a small team in a particular area, right? Or is it truly an SOD and, hey, this person should not have side A and side B? And the key thing also to think about is, for this process, this is very important to repeat on a given basis. So it can be a frequency that's defined by risk and compliance requirements. It can be quarterly, it can be annually, right? It can be a variety of those over the course of the year. And just to emphasize, right, some of the more higher risk areas that should be scrutinized, right, that we see more common amongst different organizations. You have customer master data maintenance versus producing a sales order off of the same customer, as well as on the right hand side, creating a purchase order and then processing a goods receipt then off of that same purchase order. So again, just a little bit of examples into what some of the key risks are. So with that, and now with a understanding of what kind of analyses are out there and some of the methodology around it, we're going to get into, I'm going to turn it over to John to get us to start talking about, how to review, how to investigate, and, basically coming up and socializing now what you found.
Thanks, Marco. Yeah, so depending on, how this type of analysis is being used and what kind of project you're embarking on, the biggest question we often get with these types of projects is, what do we do once we have the results, right? So it's one thing to have the expertise to go and find all of the potential transactions or exceptions that have occurred as a result of the SOD, but what do you do with those results? So how do we leverage everything to drive some action in the business, or to gain comfort from an audit perspective? So these steps are really about driving accountability out to the business, away from IT, is the most critical thing to happen here. So if this SOD access becomes a function of the IT organization needing to address the conflicts and remediate the system and that sort of thing, that's not going to be an easy conversation. It's difficult to perform those things, and often the business needs to be involved to understand what can be cleaned up and how can it be addressed. So these types of SOD quantification results are really effective for sort of driving some of this responsibility and engaging the business, and really transferring some of that ownership to the business, so you can understand what's occurred, what's the real exposure, and drive the action towards focusing on where to remediate. So beyond remediation, we may also need to understand what's happened and is it appropriate. So in the cases where we're using these results for more of an audit perspective, what can we do, or how can we, engage our business owners or reviewers to look at the data and understand what to do with it. So this is just an example process flow of something we've used before, but just starting from left to right, did the test that we ran report any results, right? So for this particular SOD that we did a quantification test, do we have any exceptions? Best case scenario is no. Then it just becomes really important that we document and obtain evidence of how we tested this. So, if the create a vendor, pay a vendor example is being tested, if no one actually touched or changed any vendor accounts, you can kind of stop there and move on, as long as you can just show and prove that none of that activity occurred. So if we do have results, though, the next question is kind of, is there any mitigating control that would have already been performed that would mitigate these transactions? So, the idea is to avoid redundant review if we've already had, a business reviewer involved in this process that approved the transaction. If, there was a control and we, don't need to review those things, is there any residual risk, though? So is there any sort of threshold in those types of controls where, maybe transactions under a particular dollar amount actually don't get reviewed, even though it looks like that risk is mitigated by this control? So we might want to look at, something underneath a particular dollar threshold if there's a lot of volume, or anything else in the data that might look, suspicious or not covered by the control. And also important consideration at the end there is, did the control pass your, SOX testing or your effectiveness testing on the year? So if we're relying on these controls to say that these results are appropriate, we need to make sure that those controls are reliable, of course. So if there's any, concern in any particular area, whether it's by the site or particular set of users that need to be investigated, you can trim down the amount of data you have to look at based on those areas where the control might have failed. And the whole process should really be documented. There should be a rationale or attestation from the managers or the controllers that oversee these users and their transactions. So all that stuff, should be captured in the review that's performed on these results. So moving on, how do you convey the results at a high level of what you found from this type of testing? So showing things, at a bit higher level here. This example is by our, individual risks, but we're kind of juxtaposing the results from our access control solution or access management solution with, the can-do results or the potential to perform versus the SOD quantification results of what actually happened. So this is a nice way of showing that you may have a lot of concern based on the access results that you're looking at. These couple risks here, we see 12 users had access to this first risk, 72 users had access to the second one. There's thousands of conflicts of different transactions or different transaction codes or authorizations that conflict that result in the ability to carry out this risk. But when we actually perform this analysis, excuse me, we can see that the overall user count drops dramatically. The first risk has not even been transacted against. The second risk is a far smaller set of data to have to, do some substantive testing or evidence-based review of, compared to a massive set of users and potential conflicts. So juxtaposing these sets of data can help tell a really interesting story. As far as digging a little bit deeper, so if you're in the position where you need to go and look at the results a little bit closer, summarizing things by user and company code is kind of the first place we start. Excuse me one second. Like showing things based on the number of occurrences and the dollar amounts at a high level with this sort of cross pivot view can help quickly illustrate what's occurred for each of the individual tests. So it's a little more difficult to do this across all your different transactions, because you're often looking at very different types of data. One SOD test will be showing you invoices where the user changed the vendor. Another one might be showing you purchase orders that the user also released. So you're looking at very different sets of data, and summing them up can be a little bit more challenging at a higher level. But to look at something like this on a risk by risk basis, it can quickly tell us, what user we might need to investigate a little further, or if we, are understanding of which users should be performing activities, it can help us focus on things that might be more concerning. So unexpected, processing across company codes and that sort of thing. But getting down to the actual line item data, this is the type of data that, you should have to complement all this high level reporting. You can pass this off to functional resources and people that are very familiar with the data, that can understand what, exactly which company code, which documents were posted, which vendor accounts were they posted to. Sometimes things like the document type that was used, or the vendor accounts that were posted to might tip off someone with knowledge of this, process area, that maybe these transactions are not as concerned if they're intercompany or something of that nature. But this type of detailed data is really, what everything is based on, and what you can send as part of a package for your business review to be performed. And then, of course, we can also bring things up to a very high level. You can do some data visualization to show where these things are happening across the country. We've put together some things like this, where we have dashboards and more interactive ways of testing the data, depending how many people need to be involved, how many stakeholders you have reviewing these sort of transactions, how global the company is. You may need to spend some time at a high level just understanding the transactions that have occurred, and visualizing things that in this way can really help get different perspectives from different people in the organization, different executive leadership, to help understand the stories behind what's happening here, and how you can take your next steps, whether that's remediating or passing your audit, whatever those next steps might be. So Rocco, you want to take us through some potential techniques for actually carrying out one of these types of projects?
Yeah, definitely. So how do we get to the data that we saw on this, I guess, 2 slides ago, right? The line item data. And, as we were saying before, there's 2 types of techniques, right? More manual and real time. So just revisiting, our maturity level here, right? The more manual is more towards the bottom, right? More time consuming, higher potential risk. You have your periodic checks, and then you go into your optimized security up above. So we asked the question before, what's next? Is there a better way? And again, to emphasize, that better way is to actually look at the actual violations, right? So identifying and summing up the financial impact, and looking at potentially a continuous monitoring solution, depending on whether or not you've done your manual assessment and you want to elevate your review or your reviewing capacity, right? Or your capacity to manage your risk. Yeah, so really just driving home the point of focusing in on those actual violations. So for the sake of this example, let's say we're doing our we have risk violation data, and we want to make sure we're doing a quant assessment for maintaining, or for anybody who has maintained a vendor and issued a payment over $1,000 to that same vendor. From a manual perspective, you would need to do a set of these steps, effectively jumping in to SAP and looking at your table data, and starting at the accounting document header, right? Traditionally BKPF. You're really starting to look at, and you can effectively put in your different criteria, right, as you're pulling these tables in SAP, right? Depending on the fiscal year you want to look at, if you have particular document types, right, different company codes, you can effectively filter what you need to using your SAP table interface. And then once you have your accounting header on the vendor payment side, you can also look at the line items, right? So getting the different line items that have been processed that complement the header data. So once you have the payment vendor payment side, you need to look at the other side of the risk. So going to your table data and your change documents more specifically for your vendor master data. So as an example, LFA1 and in other tests, maybe this, for those familiar with SAP, the change document header table and the change line item table. And what do you do when you have these items? So it requires several joins, but effectively tying out each one so you can really find what user effectively has done side A, which is, first perform vendor maintenance, and then side B, which is then processing a payment to that same vendor. And you can see that really it's a little bit more time intensive, right? If you want to do this, very manually, as we mentioned before, there are other accelerators that are available to help facilitate, or do a little bit more in the way of efficiency as far as point in time assessments like this. But on the other hand, actually, before I get to the on the other hand part, there are a few key things to consider, right? And I kind of touched on these as I was going through the examples, but looking at the different tables and looking what fields and values you want to evaluate. If you're going to go down the path of creating custom reports, just know that it's a little bit more time consuming. It's also very important not to put too much emphasis, or just relatively be careful when you're managing information outside of SAP, because that data, whether it be privacy concerns or data manipulation concerns, it's not within SAP past that point. Excuse me. And then the final two here, it's key to, as I said before, in the follow-up portion, right, of your methodology, you want to make sure that you're keeping up on your owners and keeping up on your process and developing that process so that you can continually review and assess, the results as needed. And it's not a one and done, just to say. So as you go through this process, we said it should be, an annual process, or a process that is given, or there's a process at a frequency at a given point in time in the year where, this should be reassessed, right? And if there's any changes that need to be put in place when you're ramping up that next SOD quantification assessment, that's when you should do it. Revisit any reporting requirements that you may have, or anything new that may have come up in the last year. So now, on the flip side of a more manual process, so one, I'll talk about, why it's important to have a continuous monitoring solution, and really its benefits. So as we mentioned before, a more manual process is more manual, it's more time consuming, right? It's subject to having evidence that not contained within a central repository, potentially. But some of the key things that are a benefit to having a continuous monitoring solution, it enforces, your standard controls across the system, right? It's a little bit more flexible. It has that reduction of manual controls and a manual emphasis on manual quantification. And depending on what solution you have, it allows the users to take more primary ownership over the risks. And as we mentioned many times before, to focus on the true exceptions. And one of those solutions is Pathlock's access violation management tool, or transaction monitoring, for those familiar with that naming convention. And just to say, the solution, the AVM solution allows you to effectively connect to a lot of different solutions and really help tie together that quantification aspect. And that's the key thing, right? How does AVM help? Basically, it allows you to have a one-stop shop for managing your risk. So as we said before, where a manual control, you have potentially an email process right, to send over the results to the owner. Then the owner has to go out and perform their review, then document their results, right? AVM allows you to effectively, as I said, have a one-stop shop. The system itself can run the queries that need to be ran on a real-time basis. It could be nightly, it can be monthly, right, or quarterly, depending on your appetite for risk. And then once your assessment is effectively complete, or the job's complete, it will automatically do the analysis for you. And depending on how you structure your control ownership or your risk ownership, those exceptions can be sent directly to an owner. And as just to emphasize too, once it's sent directly to the owner can use AVM as the direct portal or interface to perform their analysis or perform their review and document any of their findings, whether it be uploading attaching email communications as evidence, or providing their comments directly within the application itself. It definitely allows for a reduction in the overhead when it comes to, I would say, managing the SOD risks that come up from a quantification assessment. Those true SOD issues. And just to say, AVM does have, a good amount of different reporting capabilities. So as an example, you have different dashboards that can give you your overall risk exposure and your financial exposure. You can have customizable emails, reminder emails to the different control owners, and more to the one-stop shop idea. This is an example of a work inbox of a quote-unquote control owner, but more or less, the person who owns the risk, right? So as you can see, there's a whole listing of users that have created SOD exceptions or have generated SOD exceptions for a handful of risks. And as I mentioned before, well, not as I mentioned before, but within AVM, you're able to look at the detail items very closely at a line item level, all in one space, and you can action them individually, you can action them in mass, right, depending on if there's a common theme to them. But it gives, there's a lot of benefit to managing everything in a one-stop application. And I won't touch on this because I think I've mentioned it as we've gone along. So in the interest of time, I'll turn it over to John to see if we can go through a case study or two.
Thanks, Rocco. Yeah, I think with our case studies here, a lot of what we've encountered as we worked on these kinds of projects with some of our clients is sort of, I would say, baked into a lot of the content that we've gone through already. If we could just flip through these real quickly, Rocco, just to give one example of where we've used a manual approach. This was a client who had an external audit finding of a material deficiency with a lot of SOD access. They wanted to perform a SOD quantification to understand what's actually happened, to determine how material this deficiency really was. So kind of one of the more basic examples. But I think if we jump just 2 slides ahead, the kind of lessons learned here is when you do these things manually and when there's a big time crunch, it's hard to analyze a lot in a short amount of time, right? So this was two production instance landscape, coming in with a lot of audit concerns and needing to extract and understand a lot of data in a short amount of time. So what I would encourage as a lessons learned from these kinds of examples, and we were successful here, but it is very difficult to try to come through this, and you need to pull a lot of extra time from business folks at the year end. So as you're thinking about this, if there isn't time to implement some sort of more continuous solution, try to think about this stuff throughout the year. If you're going to have SOD concerns, think about how you're going to address the substantive piece of that in addition to your remediation, if that's what's going on. The next case study here is where we've actually implemented the Pathlock AVM solution. And this client, we actually were performing this manual analysis for in the past, and once the AVM solution had kind of hit the market, they were one of the early adopters. But so they were doing a access control implementation, a role redesign, and sort of defining an entire governance, organization within their company. So we actually were doing manual quantification while they were, or before they were putting these measures in place, as well as during, and then afterwards, we implemented AVM to kind of continue this SOD quantification process for them, so that they would have continuous monitoring, going forward. So the next is a timeline of how that project was laid out, but lessons learned there. Some of the findings were interesting, right? It's not just that you have, sometimes having a lot of SOD access doesn't necessarily mean you have a lot of financial exposure, and that's why it's good to do these types of projects. But sometimes low amounts of access can actually yield significant amounts of results. So I think that's sort of the big takeaways I wanted to share from the case studies. I think the next, we were going to wrap up if you go to that slide, Rocco, but I think we've covered a lot of good information, and I do want to turn it back over to Stephanie to engage the group. I see some hands up, so Stephanie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, John and Rocco, for your presentations. Again, if you have any questions, please add them now into the question box so that we can see those and ask those. I see in the panel that there are some hands up, so if you would like to ask your question, we can go ahead and answer those. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, I just wanted to make a few announcements. You'll see in your chat box that I put the link to the Pathlock Innovation Series. We still have a few sessions coming up today, and if you would like to attend those, go ahead and click on that link and you can register for those sessions. Also, if you would like to attend any of the sessions tomorrow or the coming days, you'll find those in the link there. So we just wanted to thank everyone for coming. I'm not seeing any questions. So we just wanted to thank everybody for coming to this presentation, and we hope to see you at future events. And thank you so much, John and Rocco, for your presentations.
Of course, yeah. Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you.